I'd just like to make a small point that in Chabad the focus is perhaps a little less on the future but more on the present. We believe in living the Jewish present, and the future will take care of itself as long as we have today a Jewish present. As you know, Chabad, shall we say historically, is coming from Europe, Eastern Europe. In fact, for 200 years, the Chabad movement was based in Europe. The Lubavitcher Rebbes, for those in their Chabad house who once in a while, anyone knows what the word Farbrengen means? Right? You do. Once in a while, your rabbi makes a Farbrengen, you ask, what's today's Farbrengen for? He says, well, the Alter Rebbe came out of prison, the Mittler Rebbe came out of prison, the Frierdiker Rebbe came out of prison. They tell the story about the fellow who hears about all these parties. He says, listen, the religion ain't so bad, but the people you're hanging out with, I'm very worried about that. There's obviously, when you go to Israel and they show you around, and you go on a tour and you look at things and they tell you something is old. Old over there means about 3,000 years old. If it's new, it's like only 800 years old. And of course, in the United States, when you look at something, old means it's about 90 years, new means like about 5 or 6 years or something like that, or a little bit older. But now in Europe, we're sort of in the middle, because obviously, I'll give you an example. Our Chabad house is oldish, or in some ways it's new. It's only 100 years old. The Chabad house, although it has its own history, which was the Chabad house was actually one of the Nazi headquarters during the Second World War, and today it's the Chabad house. That's the... We don't just outlive them, but we also, and I believe my friend Rabbi Tachtel from Berlin has a similar situation. The school is also based in former Nazi headquarters, but that is definitely, shall we say, a Jewish response to the Holocaust, is to teach Jewish children and Jewish adults in the place where the Nazis tried to plot our destruction. Okay, just a brief perspective, shall we say, for myself. I'm unable to claim leadership role in Chabad in Europe. I only get 49% of the vote in my own house. So at least I'm aware what goes on in Denmark, in Scandinavia specifically, and then I'm fairly aware. I come from England originally, friends, communication, we meet once in a while, so I do hear what goes on around Europe. First, let me start with some numbers, and for the purpose of this presentation, I was just looking a little bit into how has Chabad grown, and 20 years ago, Chabad was in 13 countries in Europe. Today, Chabad is in 38 countries in Europe. I know you think there's not that many countries in Europe. I know we made up a few to... it's both in and out of the European Union. 38 countries, over 300 cities. I didn't have the wherewithal to actually find out how many Chabad rabbis, but I think there's probably many... I don't know if it's close to 1,000. Many cities have more than one. In Berlin, there are 10? 8? 7. The 8th one is coming in 2 weeks. Okay, each one in London, there are, I don't know if it's 50 or more. Manchester, and you go through the cities, Paris has hundreds, you go through the cities, there are many Chabad rabbis. The challenges. You could break it down into 12, not 12 points. Nobody wants to hear 12-point talk. 3 points, you could say the issues are anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish legislation, spillover, effective anti-Semitism on some level, and assimilation. And obviously, it's not black and white. In a sense, when we talk about, shall we say, anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish legislation, I wouldn't say it's all black. It's definitely not all white. But it's one thing has affected the other, which is the Islamization I wouldn't say that Europe is Islamized, but there are a lot of Muslims. And in that sense, this effect has had a kickback, that there's been a fair amount of anti-Muslim legislation, which has evolved into anti-Jewish practice legislation. And one of the two issues were, of course, bris milah and shechita. Both of them are directed not at the Jewish communities, because the Jewish communities, truthfully, are not dramatically large enough in order to warrant this sort of legislation in that way, but it is much more directed against the Muslim communities. However, obviously we are affected. What are we doing about it? You know, the Chabad, whenever you come to them, they always seem to have the same answer. Say l'chaim, have faith in Hashem, be proud in who you are. And the truth be told is that the response to a lot of these challenges is in many ways similar, in the sense that, although a fairly typical response, and it's obviously needed, let's say, for example, anti-Semitism. I just want to give you, for a moment, some examples of anti-Semitism in Europe. I sat on Friday with a Chabad rabbi in Toulouse. He described to me his daughter smelling the gunpowder of the crazed gunman killing these three people in Toulouse. His daughter was standing right next to it, was one of her friends. So there was, of course, the incident in Toulouse. And there has been other incidents in Europe. We actually had an incident in Denmark, not in Copenhagen, but we had in a city nearby in Odense, where a number of Israelis were shot at. They were actually hit, but they were not killed, Baruch Hashem. And then there is attacks. Some of them very dramatic. One example is the city, as Rabbi Eliezer mentioned, the city of Malmo, which is actually very close to Copenhagen. It's a 35-minute train ride away, and it's actually sort of like night and day between the two. I actually, unfortunately, my tefillin got stolen a couple of weeks ago. Thank God somebody found them. Denmark people are very nice. You know, the Danes actually saved all the Jews during the Second World War. I actually recently met one of the guys who did it. He was 93 years old. I said, "Can I come see you?" He says, "Sure." I said, "Can I come at 10 o'clock? He says, No. 10 o'clock I go swimming in the sea. This is in October, and it's cold. 10 o'clock I go swimming in the sea. I said, "How old are you?" He says, 93 years old. He says, "I think I got the strength, I get a special blessing, because he saved 800 Jews on his own." So, but in Denmark, so anyway, I found my tefillin, but I was missing my tefillin for a few days, so I needed to go borrow a pair of tefillin. I went over to Malmo. Every day when I would go over to Malmo, I needed to go over a couple of days, just being in the train station. Somebody would scream at me, somebody would shout at me, somebody would, harass me a little bit. So it's a very difficult situation. The Chabad rabbi there has very difficult challenges. And obviously, our way of dealing with it is awareness. The first thing is awareness. The other thing is not hiding, which means not saying that if we're going to go away, the problem is going to go away. I had a group of kids from Malmo, Sweden that was staying by me, and we were discussing the situation. They said, "You know what? The Chabad rabbi walks the street looking like a Jew. Because of that," and these are kids, not religious, kids in high school. He says, "Because of that, I'm not scared to say that I'm Jewish to my high school class." That was a very powerful point. It's the idea of trickle down, which means one person is actually walking the street and taking the brunt of it, but it means that other people also say, "Hey, you know what? If he can walk the street like that, then I can also be proud of who I am and not be fearful and not be scared." And that's one element of it. And obviously there's the other elements, which is dealing with the government, communication. Chabad in Washington was actually quite helpful in getting, believe it or not, Obama's personal representative to Jewish communities came down to Malmo. And believe it or not, even a very left-wing mayor, when a fellow knocks on the door and says, "I'm Obama's personal representative," they begin to listen. They think Obama's going to do something to them. So the mayor actually started persecuting the people that were harassing them. So that was definitely a positive thing. And we obviously have very good communication and interaction with both the local Jewish communities and then the international organizations, the Simon Wiesenthal Center and others that get involved in these sort of things. And obviously a combination of the forces helps to impact the situation. Rabbi Bisritsky, the rabbi of Hamburg, told me an interesting story. He recently made a Hachnasa Sefer Torah. He brought a Sefer Torah, and you know, in Europe, people usually don't go out and say that they're Jewish, declare that they're Jewish, but they were marching along with the Sefer Torah and the music, and then a couple of days later, he gets a call from somebody, and they say, you know, my grandfather's brother or something like that, some relative, was a German soldier, and they saw a synagogue being burnt in Ukraine, and they went in and they rescued the Torah. They realized that it was important, and they took the Torah home with them, and we have it in our basement. We've had it ever since the war. And we didn't really know what it was. We just knew it was something Jewish. But yesterday I saw you guys in the news with the Torah marching. I realized what it was. I want to come and bring over the Torah. They come. It wasn't a whole Torah. They brought over this part of the Torah. And it's this idea of bringing awareness, really, shall we say, has a trickle-down effect, which has an impact also on anti-Semitism. With regard to anti-Jewish legislation, I'm not sure if you're aware, but I know, for example, in Europe is the least religious place in the world. Right? Religion is not a very popular thing in Europe. In fact, according to statistics, there was just an article about it in a Danish newspaper, which describes that according to statistics, is the less affluent the country is, the more religious they are. There is only one exception to that, and that is the United States of America. The United States of America, despite being, I believe, the most affluent country in the world, at the same time, religion plays a very strong role. Unfortunately, in Europe, religion does not play a strong role. So therefore, you have the challenge, which is, take something like Bris Milah. Anybody ever tried explaining Bris Milah to a non-Jew? Has anybody ever tried that? I would say it's a little bit, it's a little bit risky. I once sat in a room at Bris Milah, and the mother had converted, and she had all her uncles who were all physicians, and they were all standing around. You know, the difference between a Jewish bris, a bris when it's all Jews, is that everybody hogs the moil. They all stand right next to the moil, so nobody can see what's going on. But non-Jews, they don't do that. They all stand back politely, so everybody gets a good view of what's going on. It's not a good idea. So I have a friend that actually invited all his classmates to his son's bris. Unfortunately, they were all Jewish guys, a lot of them with non-Jewish girlfriends, and they were all standing around the room, and all these very nice Danish girls who were looking very pale. The next year, he had another baby. He invited the guys back, but he told them to leave their girlfriends at home, and I think that was a correct thing to do. But obviously, when you try to explain Bris Milah to non-Jews, it becomes quite difficult. And so in that sense, this happened in Germany, this happened in Denmark, it happened in Sweden, it happened in Norway, that there was attempts to make anti-Jewish legislation, anti-Bris legislation, and obviously in each place it's dealt with in different ways. And because really, the United States of America, what flies in California doesn't work in Georgia, right? It's different, there's a different language. Europe is that 1,000 times more different. Every place has a different language. So although Rabbi Techtel very well argued very eloquently that it would be very inappropriate that the German country should be the first one to make anti-Jewish legislation, in Denmark you can't use that sort of argument. So every place one has to use the appropriate arguments, and Baruch Hashem, with regard to anti-Shechita legislation and Bris legislation, those are things that have been suspended. But every once in a while, there's not a lot of things going on in Europe, so every once in a while, when it's, as they say, a slow news day, so the newspaper brings it up again. In Danish, they call it cucumber season. When I don't know if it works in English, but they call it cucumber season when there's nothing else to write about, so they write about how the cucumbers are growing. So in a similar way, that's when they bring it up again, and it has to be dealt with again. The obvious challenge, of course, is assimilation. And this is something, there's a very high assimilation rate. And I would say that in many ways there are large Jewish communities in Europe. The large Jewish communities are getting larger. To name some of them, there's, of course, the big ones are there's London, there's Manchester, there's Paris, and I personally I would love to say that Copenhagen is one of them, but it's not as of yet. But I'm a good friend of Rabbi Teichtel, and we went on Shlichus about the same time, about 16 years ago. And I remember coming to visit him about 15 years ago. And at that time, you would say Berlin is a little Jewish city, not a very big Jewish city. Today, Berlin is a large, bustling Jewish city, definitely the ultimate Jewish revenge. There are schools, there are shuls, there are restaurants. By the way, he's got a mean sushi restaurant over there, right? There's restaurants, there's yeshivas. There's a tremendous amount going on. It's amazing to think Berlin, the center of all this evil, should today be the base of so much good. And then you go through, and obviously in Russia, which I'm not as familiar with, you have the large cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg. There are large Jewish communities there. There are people that they feel comfortable living there. Generally, these are places where people are able to economically, they're able to do well. They feel comfortable with living there as Jews. And then there are the smaller Jewish communities. I would include Copenhagen as one of them, where there are smaller Jewish communities, and they face a little bit more challenges. Some of them can be responded with modern technology. Today we have a website called, not myself, but there exists a website called kosherforyou.eu. You type in, you make your order, 2 days later there's a big package or 12 packages, however many packages of food you've ordered, and you get lots of delicious food. Schooling, this is something that's obviously being responded to by Chabad. There are people living in little small communities. Chabad rabbi in Toronto told me he was contacted by a woman in northern Sweden, and she had a question. He said, why didn't you contact your local rabbi? He says, well, the closest rabbi is 9 hours away. For those that are familiar, Sweden is very large. Sweden is, from one place to very extremely large. So he said, why don't you go? He says, well, you're my local Jewish rabbi. I'm on Chabad.org every day, and I'm listening to your classes. That's so you're my rabbi, so you've got to tell me what to do. So in that sense, internet, which means the online school is something that Jewish children are able to study with. There's the Chabad online school, there's the Chabad online school that is for children in remote Jewish communities, that is able to give a Jewish education to many kids. That is one of the ways of responding to it. There are campuses. There's Chabad on campus in Europe, which now I believe has over 15 centers of places that are full-time working on campuses. The impact, especially at that age, of young people who are in university, and this is for many of them the first time they're exposed to really what is an anti-Israel agenda by many people, and it makes them insecure about their identity. And the Chabad on campus being there, the UK I believe has 12, Rabbi Safran? No? Something like that, more than that. I was just in Oxford a few weeks ago. Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, and a bunch of other places. And in that sense, being on the campuses is a response to assimilation. Being in the communities is a very powerful response to assimilation, and education is obviously the most powerful response to education. The Rebbe taught us, one of the perspectives that the Rebbe taught us, which is in many ways what, in a sense, makes the Chabad approach unique, that it's not about numbers. It's not about creating such a large thing that so many people should be impressed. It's about the individual Jew. And so therefore, if one Jew needs one thing, Chabad is there in order to be able to respond. Rabbi Wolf from Helsinki, Finland, told me a story of a woman about 500 miles away from him that wanted to make a bris for her child. And he said, fine, I'll organize, 500 miles a long way, I'll organize a mohel to come from England. And the mohel came along, and the mohel was, he didn't really understand the circumstances, so he calls up the woman and says, go to the local, now my language, I speak a few languages at this point in time, so I think in English we call it chemist, in Danish we call it apotheke, in American it's called a pharmacy. Thank you very much. Go to the local pharmacy and pick up this razor blade and this tweezers, and And the woman was a little bit traumatized by having to go buy a razor blade and all that stuff to do a bris milah. She said, I don't think I'm going to do a bris. It's not for me. So Rabbi Wolf said, really it's very important. So she said, you know what, if you, Rabbi Wolf, come to help out the bris, then I'll do it. Okay, so Rabbi Wolf makes the journey 500 miles, and he comes there, and they do the bris. And basically all he's there is to hold the girl's hand, not literally, but like to be there by the mile, that the woman should be secure enough in order to do this little child's bris. And when he's leaving, he's on his way back to the airport or wherever it was, he suddenly hears somebody from across the street say, "Hey, Shalom Aleichem." And this is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I don't know if there's any people there, definitely not Jews. So he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" It was a Jewish kid from New York whose mother had called Rabbi Wolf and said, my son has totally separated himself from us. He's up there somewhere in the middle of Finland. Please get in touch with him. Anyway, and he worked out that it was that kid. So I don't know what his name was. It's Chaim Yankel. He said, "Chaim Yankel, how do you know I'm Chaim Yankel?" He said, "The Rebbe sent me here today. I thought it was to hold the mole's hand, but it was really in order to find you." And that way he was in touch with him. And in that sense, it's the idea of touching the individual, touching each person where they are, as they are, and in that sense, bringing them a step closer. I'll conclude. Now, Baruch Hashem, in Europe, we haven't had any tsunamis. We had a flood last year in Copenhagen, but everybody was insured, I think. But I got a call once, and a fellow says, now for those that are familiar, I'm actually from England. I apologize for speaking with an American accent. I gave it away at some point. It's a little bit complicated when there's a few languages going on. My kids speak 4 languages. They speak English, they speak Danish, they speak Yiddish, a bit of Hebrew. And so I got a call once. The fellow says, "Hello, is this Lubavitch?" And I'm like, "Yeah." "Okay, the chief rabbi said that if you want to find a Jew, you call Lubavitch. There's a Jew called Stephen Benjamin. I want you to find him in 1 week." Okay? Anyway, it turns out that this fellow, Stephen Benjamin, was a fellow that had Rahman al-San run away from his wife. And the child, it was 10 years earlier, and the child was now grown up. His son that he'd left was now grown up, and really he wanted to meet his father. And so the chief rabbi of England, Jonathan Sachs, a good personal friend of my father, but also a very close with Chabad. For those that were here last year, he gave a great speech at the conference of Shluchim. So he always says, if you want to find a Jew, you call Lubavitch. That's his statement. I guess it's where people call his office and they're trying to find someone. He says, "Call Lubavitch, don't call me." But so he says, he'd heard this. So he says, "I'm looking for a Jew, you call Lubavitch." Anyway, so I said, "Who is this guy, Stephen Benjamin?" So he describes him to me, and I'm sitting there thinking, and I said, "You know what? I think I might know who he is, because about 6 months ago, it was Erev Pesach, and I was buying something, and I was standing on the street, and a guy walks by me, and he says, 'Shalom, shalom,' and I responded to him, and we had a little conversation, and I invited him to the Seder, and he actually showed." Now, you guys have been to a Seder at Chabad, right? Or maybe you haven't, but if you have, you'll know that a Seder at Chabad is not exactly the time where you have these deep, intimate conversations, because there's a lot of people there. Anyway, so I had a 30-second conversation with him on the street, and another 25-second conversation when I was finding him a seat at the Seder. So I said, "I remember the guy. I don't know his name, I don't know his number, I don't know anything." I tried to look it up on the web, couldn't find it. What does a chassid do when you're in trouble or when you need help? You ask a bracha from the Rebbe. The fellow was so confident, he said, "I'm calling back in 7 days. You've got to find this guy." I'm like, "I know, definitely no guarantees. You're welcome to call back. I'll talk to you and everything like that, but I wouldn't guarantee it." Anyway, I asked a bracha from the Rebbe. This was actually a couple of days before Sukkot. The second day of Sukkot, now I've been in Copenhagen now 16 years. This fellow walks into shul. I have never seen him in shul since and not before. I've never seen him in shul since. And the guy shows up. I'm like, oh my God, something's happening right over here. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I invited him home. I got his telephone number. I was a little bit nervous about telling that somebody was looking for him because he was trying to run away. Anyway, but I got his number, and I put his child in touch with the father. The child called me. He says, because it was a personal issue, his father had run away from him. He said, should I be in touch with my father? What do you think? I said, listen, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I can't tell you, but I'll just tell you. Somebody was pulling some strings over there that your father walked into shul 2 days after this guy had called me and asked me, is that Lubavitch? Because the chief rabbi said that if you want to find a Jew, you call Lubavitch. Anyway, that's the short and the long, as they say. Thank you for listening and paying attention, I hope. They tell the story about the guy that says, my job is to speak, your job is to listen. I hope we both finish at the same time. Thank you very much.